Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than usual. The twisted, wicked, and morally wrong lives of medieval kings who turned total power into total evil. We're diving into the shadowy side of royal history, where crowns came with more than just special rights. They came with the freedom to follow every dark desire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's start tonight's journey together. Being a medieval king wasn't just about wearing a crown and giving royal orders. It was about having complete power over millions of lives, controlling huge treasuries, and living in a world where saying no to a king could mean death. For some rulers, this exciting mix of power and being untouchable created monsters. Tonight, we'll look at the most evil royal people from the medieval period, men whose desires had no limits and whose cruel acts became famous stories. But before we dive deep into these dark stories, we need to understand something very important about the medieval world. This was a time when ideas about right and wrong were very different from ours, when violence was normal, and when the idea of human rights didn't exist at all. What we're looking at tonight isn't just personal evil, but the natural result of total power ruining people completely in a world with almost no rules for how kings could act. Medieval Europe was made up of many kingdoms where the belief that God chose kings ruled everything. Kings weren't just leaders. People truly believed God himself picked them. This belief in God's choice meant that questioning a king's actions was almost the same as questioning God. The church, while teaching Christian kindness, often went along with the king's bad actions because bishops and abbots got their jobs from the king. In this world of total power, some rulers stayed honorable and fair. Others, however, fell into levels of evil that shocked even the tough people of their time. The men we'll meet tonight show the worst things that can happen when someone has unlimited power and unlimited desires. The medieval royal court was full of secrets, flattery, and giving up morals to stay safe. Surrounded by nobles who needed the king's favor to survive, these kings almost never heard the word no. Marriage was only for politics. Love was something almost no one could have, and being faithful was expected only from queens, never from kings. This unfair rule gave male kings freedom to chase anything they wanted. Our first king ruled England from 1199 to 1216 during one of the most troubled times in medieval history. John Lackland, as his enemies called him to make fun of him, became hated not just for losing his lands in France or being forced to sign the Magna Carta, but for a pattern of forcing himself on women that scared even the tough people of his time. Writers from that time, who usually tried to keep some respect when talking about kings, wrote very honest things about John's actions. Matthew Paris, one of the most trusted writers from that time, said John regularly seduced or forced the wives and daughters of his nobles, creating fear and anger across his kingdom that went way beyond normal political fights. This wasn't just fooling around, which people expected and usually accepted from kings. John's actions crossed lines that even his cruel time found shocking. He seemed to enjoy humiliating his nobles by forcing their women into his bed and then bragging about it at court parties. The mental pain he caused often hurt more than any physical harm. One of the worst cases was with the wife of a Welsh prince during peace talks. John was trying to make peace on the Welsh border when he became obsessed with the princess. According to Welsh records, he demanded her as part of the peace deal, treating a real person like land he could trade. When her husband said no, John attacked Wales just to take her. The princess was brought to his court, where she stayed as his mistress for months. People who saw her wrote about her clear sadness and growing hopelessness as she understood she could never leave. She died within a year, said to be from deep sadness, though today's historians think it was probably suicide. Her death started a long family fight with Wales that bothered John for the rest of his rule. But John's desires went far beyond noble families. Old records say several abbesses complained straight to the Pope about John making unwanted moves on nuns in their care. One very upsetting story says John forced his way into a convent and threatened the head nun with violence unless she gave him her youngest nuns. The planned way John hunted women shows it was more than just wanting sex. He seemed to use sexual attacks as a way to control politics, breaking the spirit of people who might fight against him. When he took an enemy's castle, he would often demand the lord's wife or daughters as prisoners, and everyone knew what that really meant. Maybe the most shocking thing was how openly John talked about what he did, unlike most kings who at least pretended to be private about it. John made rude jokes about his latest victims at big royal dinners, often right in front of their husbands or fathers. This wasn't just hurting people, it was planned humiliation meant to break the will of men who might have stood against him. The mental harm to John's victims was terrible. Several old writings say noble wives went to live in convents after being with the king, saying they couldn't stand to look at men anymore. Others reportedly never spoke again after being forced to stay at court. The pain from John's cruelty spread through whole families and towns. John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême was itself a huge scandal that showed he didn't care about normal rules. He literally took her from her fiancé Hugh of Lusignan on their wedding day, ruining not just two lives, but a whole web of political friendships. This sudden act made strong enemies in France and led directly to John losing his lands there. Even in his own marriage, John acted badly. Even though he had a young and reportedly beautiful queen, he kept doing his harmful actions. Isabella lived in constant fear, seeing how her husband treated other women, and knowing that queens who upset their husbands could be sent away, locked up, or worse. The mental pressure was so strong that she reportedly suffered from what doctors then called sadness, probably what we now call serious depression. The political results of John's sexual attacks were as harmful as the personal pain to his victims. By 1215, John faced the biggest noble rebellion in English history. While the rebels said they wanted fair laws and lower taxes, private letters show many nobles were really angry about years of sexual shame and harm. The famous Magna Carta got a lot of support from men who hated their king for personal reasons. The document itself, while mostly about laws and money, had quiet hints about protecting people from random royal actions. Many of these rules made more sense when you knew what John's people had really gone through. The focus on fair trials and protection from sudden punishment showed the real life of nobles who had seen their wives and daughters taken into royal rooms. John's rule also set dangerous examples for how kings could act that would affect English kings for many years. His planned use of sexual attacks to control people, his total ignoring of marriage rules, and his willingness to break into church-safe places all pushed the limits of what kings could do without punishment. Future kings would remember these examples, sometimes copying him. The king's death in 1216, maybe from poison given by a monk who couldn't stand John's treatment of women in his monastery anymore, was celebrated all over England. The happiness was so great that his 9-year-old son Henry was easily accepted as king, even though child kings usually caused trouble. The people ruling for young Henry III right away started making changes meant to stop future kings from hurting their people the way John had. Yet John's memory lived on in laws and traditions. Many of the protections written into the Magna Carta were made to stop future kings from doing the kind of random cruelty that had marked John's rule. The document's focus on protecting people from royal moods became even more urgent because everyone wanted to make sure no future king could scare his people with the same planned cruelty. Moving forward in English history, we meet Edward II, whose rule from 1307 to 1327 became a warning story about mixing personal feelings with political power. While Edward's desires were different from John's hunting women, they hurt the kingdom just as much and finally hurt himself. Edward became king after his strong father, Edward Longshanks, who had taken Wales and scared Scotland. The difference between father and son couldn't have been bigger. Where Edward I had been a warrior king who loved fighting and winning lands, Edward II liked the company of handsome young men more than the hard work of medieval war. This choice might have stayed private in a kinder time, but in 14th century Europe, it became a scandal that ruined his whole rule. The trouble started almost right after Edward became king with his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight from a normal family who had somehow won the new king's total love. Their connection was so strong and shown so openly that it shocked even the worldly English court. Writers from that time, using careful Latin words, said their relationship went far beyond normal friendship between men. Edward's actions toward Gaveston showed a man who couldn't separate his personal feelings from his duties as king. He gave his favorite titles, lands, and treasure on a scale that would have been too much even for a close family member. Making Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, one of England's most important titles, felt like a direct insult to every English noble family that had served the crown for generations. Even more shocking, Edward let Gaveston carry the crown and royal items at his own coronation, an honor that should have gone to the highest noble in the land. People who were there wrote about the two men sharing beds, kissing in public, and using sweet names usually saved for married couples. Edward gave Gaveston cute nicknames, calling him his dearest brother, though everyone knew their relationship was not like brothers. The king seemed drunk with his feelings, totally ignoring the political harm his open love was causing. The English nobles were angry for more than just hating men loving men, though that was part of it. They saw what looked like a foreign adventurer controlling their king through sex. Gaveston's proud behavior at court, his clear dislike for English ways, and his belief that the king's love made him safe made enemies everywhere. But Edward seemed blind to these worries. When his nobles demanded Gaveston leave the country, the king's reaction was so strong it seemed crazy. He would cry openly at meetings when talking about being apart from his favorite, not understanding why anyone would mind his private happiness. This wild emotion made normal ruling impossible. The first time Gaveston was sent away in 1308 lasted only a year before Edward brought him back, even though he had promised forever to keep him away. This broken promise destroyed whatever trust Edward still had with his nobles. It also showed that the king's love for Gaveston was stronger than any political need, even the safety of his throne. When Gaveston was caught and killed by rebel nobles in 1312, Edward's sadness was so deep that people who saw him said he seemed temporarily crazy. He cried without stopping for days, wouldn't eat, and promised terrible revenge against everyone involved in his favorite's death. The king's inability to act during this crisis left England without a real ruler at an important time. But Edward's story didn't end with Gaveston's death. Within a few years, he found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If anything, this second relationship was even worse than the first. Despenser was already married with children, yet he moved into the royal house and started sharing the king's bed without trying to hide it. Unlike Gaveston, who had only been greedy, Despenser was truly mean. Despenser used his power over Edward to hurt enemies, take their lands, and gain power that almost matched the king's. He was especially cruel to Edward's wife, Queen Isabella, whom he saw as a rival for the king's love. Isabella found herself pushed aside in her own court, treated badly by her husband's lover, while Edward watched and seemed to like it. The relationship with Despenser showed how deeply Edward needed his male favorites. He seemed unable to make any big decision without asking his lover first, basically giving Despenser the power to say no to royal plans. This setup might have been just embarrassing for a good ruler, but Edward's political choices were so bad that Despenser's mean advice often made things worse. Isabella's change from ignored wife to angry queen shows the bigger results of Edward's personal feelings. Smart, good at politics, and more desperate, she started planning a rebellion against her own husband. Her love affair with Roger Mortimer, an English noble sent away from court, gave her both personal freedom and the army she needed to fight Edward's rule. The attack Isabella led in 1326 worked partly because Edward's government was so hated, but also because the king's love for Despenser made him unable to plan a smart defense. Instead of gathering his soldiers or talking to the rebels, Edward ran away with his favorite, seeming to believe that as long as they were together, everything would be okay. Edward's final defeat was fast and total. Despenser was caught and killed with terrible cruelty, getting the full punishment for treason. The king himself was forced to give up his crown to his teenage son, becoming the first English king to lose his throne not from losing a battle or foreign attack, but from losing all support at home. But Edward's enemies weren't happy with just taking his crown. As long as he lived, he could be a symbol for people who might want him back. The answer was to lock him in Berkeley Castle, with guards picked for being cruel and having no morals. Edward's death in 1327 is still one of history's scariest mysteries. The official story said he died of sickness, but many stories said he was murdered in a way that made fun of his love for men. According to these stories, his killers used a red-hot metal rod pushed into his body, burning his insides while leaving no marks on the outside. Whether this awful story is true or just lies made by his enemies, it shows how completely Edward's reputation was ruined by his personal feelings. The king, who had once been seen as the hope of English knights, died alone, left even by most of his old lovers, a victim of his own inability to separate private love from public duty. Edward II's rule is a strong warning that being a medieval king needed not just being born royal, but also smart politics and control over feelings. His story shows how even real personal love could destroy everything when followed without thinking about the bigger results. In a world where everything a king did was political, Edward's biggest mistake was believing that love could exist away from power. Crossing the English Channel to medieval France, we meet Philip Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223 and whose personal feelings almost hid his great political successes. While history remembers Philip as one of France's best medieval kings, his private life was full of strange fixations that upset even the people of his fairly open-minded time. Philip's fall into obsessive actions started with what should have been a normal political marriage to Isabella of Hainault in 1180. The marriage was made to help France own lands in the Low Countries, but Philip's reaction to his 13-year-old bride quickly became much more troubling than normal royal liking. Writers from that time noticed that the 16-year-old king grew a strong physical obsession with Isabella that went way beyond what was normal for a political marriage. The young king's actions toward his bride were so extreme that they messed up the normal running of the French court. Philip could hardly work when away from Isabella, canceling important government meetings to be with her, ignoring foreign visitors who had traveled weeks to see him, and reportedly having angry fits when court rules kept them apart. His advisors started to seriously worry about the kingdom when the king's personal feelings came before running the country, but Philip's feelings for Isabella had a jealous, almost sick quality that went beyond strong love. Old writings say he became eaten up by jealousy, not letting Isabella talk alone with any man, even her own family or trusted court workers. He put guards outside her rooms, not to keep her safe, but to watch her and report everything she did. The king's watching of his wife went as far as punishing servants for giving her messages he hadn't checked himself and asking her ladies about every detail of her day. This wasn't normal royal protection. It was the actions of a man who saw his wife as a thing he owned instead of a person. Isabella, still a child herself, found herself living in what was really a fancy prison. When Isabella died giving birth in 1190, having their son Louis, Philip's sadness turned into something even stranger. Instead of accepting her death as a normal risk of having babies in those days, he seemed to take it as a personal betrayal. He wouldn't let her body be prepared for burial the normal way. Instead, he kept her corpse in their bedroom for almost a week while he sat beside it, talking to her as if she were still alive. Court people who saw Philip during this time said he seemed to have lost touch with the real world. He would have full talks with Isabella's dead body, asking questions and waiting for answers that never came. He brought her food and tried to feed her lifeless mouth, getting upset when she didn't eat. Only when church leaders threatened to say he was too crazy to rule did he finally allow a proper funeral. Even after Isabella was buried, Philip's obsession went on in upsetting ways. He had her tomb opened many times so he could see her body, and he insisted on sleeping in the same bed where she died, saying he could still feel her there. Court doctors, with their limited understanding of mental sickness, tried things like letting blood out and giving herbs, but nothing stopped Philip's unhealthy attachment to his dead wife. Philip's second marriage in 1193 to Ingeborg of Denmark created a whole new, but just as upsetting scandal. The wedding itself seemed normal, but the morning after their wedding night, Philip said he was so disgusted by his new bride that he couldn't stand to be in the same room with her, let alone stay married. The king's reaction to Ingeborg was so sudden and extreme that many historians think something terrible happened on their wedding night. Some old writings suggest that Philip's memories of his obsessive love for Isabella made him treat Ingeborg with shocking cruelty when she didn't match his perfect picture of his first wife. Instead of trying to fix whatever went wrong, Philip right away tried to get the marriage cancelled, saying God had made their marriage impossible. But Ingeborg, showing amazing courage for a medieval queen, refused to go along with cancelling the marriage. Instead of quietly going to a convent like many women would have, she wrote straight to the Pope, saying her marriage was real and that Philip was keeping her prisoner against church rules. What followed was a 20-year fight that got stranger and more embarrassing for the whole world. Philip kept Ingeborg locked in different castles and convents across France, sometimes letting her live fairly well, sometimes treating her so badly it was more like punishment than royal exile. How he treated her seemed to change with his mood, and how much pressure he got from the Pope's people. While Ingeborg was locked away, Philip got French bishops who listened to him to cancel the marriage and married a third wife, Agnes of Morania. But his relationship with Agnes showed the same obsessive patterns as with Isabella. He became so jealous that he wouldn't let her go anywhere without him, even to visit her own family inside France. When Agnes got pregnant, Philip's controlling got even worse. He reportedly made women servants taste all her food first, not for normal poison worries, but because he was scared in a crazy way that someone would hurt the baby inside her. He insisted on being there for her doctor visits and got furious when doctors said pregnant women needed rest away from their husbands. The world pressure on Philip to accept Ingeborg as his real wife grew when Pope Innocent III put all of France under interdict, basically kicking the whole kingdom out of the church until the marriage was fixed. Churches closed, no one could get church ceremonies, and dead people couldn't be buried in holy ground. Yet Philip waited years, seeming to prefer letting his whole kingdom suffer spiritually rather than lose control of his marriages. Agnes of Morania died in 1201, maybe from the stress of living under Philip's suffocating and increasingly crazy control. Her death seemed to break something important in the king's mind. He finally agreed to take Ingeborg back as queen, but their relationship stayed cold and distant for the rest of his rule. Philip had spent so many years treating her like an enemy that real making up was impossible for him. The most upsetting part of Philip's later years was how his obsessive ways spread to his own children. He had really loved his son Louis when the boy was little, but as Louis grew into his own person, Philip became more controlling and suspicious of his son's actions and friends. Philip had his grown son's letters read, his friends checked out, and his movements watched by royal spies. He seemed unable to accept that Louis had his own thoughts, feelings, and wants separate from his father. When Louis tried to act like a normal prince, Philip acted like his son was personally betraying him instead of just growing up. The mental pressure Philip put on Louis was so bad that court people started worrying about the prince's health and mind. Louis got what doctors then called sad sickness, with trouble sleeping, not wanting to eat, and times of deep sadness that today we would probably call depression. When Louis died in 1226, just before Philip himself, many people at court quietly believed the old king's possessive love had literally killed his son. Philip Augustus's rule shows how private obsessions could ruin even the most successful medieval kings. Even with his army wins over England and his smart changes that made the French crown stronger, his inability to have healthy relationships caused years of unnecessary pain for everyone around him, from his wives to his children to his people who suffered under the church punishment. The mental patterns Philip showed, his obsessive jealousy, his inability to accept loss or saying no, and his readiness to hurt others rather than look at himself, caused pain that spread far beyond his personal life. His treatment of Ingeborg became a huge world argument that hurt France's friendship with the church for many years. His suffocating control over his son may have helped cause the trouble that bothered the start of Louis XVII's rule. Maybe most importantly, Philip's actions set examples for how French kings could treat their wives and children that would affect the crown for hundreds of years. His willingness to lock up a queen who upset him, his use of church rules to excuse personal cruelty, and his belief that being king meant total control over family, all became part of how French kings remembered they could act. Moving east to medieval Russia, we meet maybe the most mentally disturbed ruler in European history. Ivan IV, known later as Ivan the Terrible, ruled from 1533 to 1584. Though he didn't get real power until his late teens, Ivan turned the Russian throne from a place of ruling into a stage for cruel experiments that scared even the tough medieval world. Ivan's change from a hopeful young ruler to a killer tyrant started with childhood pain that would have hurt anyone's mind. Crowned Tsar at just 3 years old after his father died suddenly, Ivan spent his early years watching court nobles kill each other in mean fights for control while he was too young to rule. The boy who should have been learning how to govern instead got a full lesson in betrayal, violence, and how power can be random. By the time Ivan got real control at 16, he had seen more political killing than most grown-ups see in many lifetimes. But instead of making him careful or wise, these experiences seemed to teach him that cruelty wasn't just an okay way to rule, but the only sure way to stay in charge. His first actions with real power showed a young man who had learned all the wrong lessons from his painful childhood. Ivan's early victims were court workers who had been against his family during the years others ruled for him. Instead of just firing them or taking their titles, Ivan started trying out fancy ways to kill people made to cause the most physical pain and mental scare for watchers. His favorite way was having victims thrown to hunting dogs while he watched from palace windows, seeming to really enjoy their fear and pain. People who saw wrote that Ivan laughed and cheered as his enemies were torn apart by the dogs, sometimes yelling to the dogs or making fun of the victims trying to get away. This wasn't just the cold heart of a medieval ruler ordering needed killings. It was someone who found fun in other people's pain and death. But Ivan's cruelty went far beyond political enemies. His treatment of women, especially from noble families, became famous across Russia for its planned meanness. Unlike other medieval kings, whose attacks on women came from wanting sex or power, Ivan seemed driven mostly by wanting to cause mental pain to his victims and their families. He especially liked making noble fathers watch while he hurt their daughters, then killing both the victims and watchers so news of these terrible acts wouldn't spread far outside the court. The mental torture of making family watch each other's pain seemed as important to Ivan as the physical acts. This way of acting shows something deeper than normal medieval cruelty. Ivan seemed to naturally understand how to break people's spirits by attacking the relationships they cared about most. His violence was planned in ways that went beyond just scaring people, meant to destroy not just single victims, but whole family groups who might fight against him. One of the worst examples of Ivan's planned cruelty happened in 1570, when he thought the city of Novgorod was planning to turn against him. Instead of checking these worries the normal legal way, Ivan decided to punish the whole city as a warning to other places that might not be loyal. His answer was to attack his own city and slowly torture and kill its people for 5 weeks. People who saw wrote about scenes that were hard to even imagine. Whole families burned slowly over fires, children thrown to wild animals for Ivan's soldiers to watch for fun, and large group sexual attacks done in public while Ivan watched from a throne set up in the city's main square. The Novgorod killing wasn't just army action or even normal political punishment. It was planned cruelty meant to break the minds of Ivan's whole empire. By showing he would destroy whole cities just because he suspected disloyalty, Ivan was saying that no one anywhere was safe from him. But maybe even scarier than Ivan's public terrible acts was how he treated his own wives and family. Old Russian rules let rulers have more than one wife if earlier ones died, and Ivan used this rule as much as possible. By most history records, he married 7 times, though several marriages lasted only weeks or months before the wives died in strange ways. Ivan's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, seems to have been truly loved by the young Tsar, and her death in 1560 started the worst time of his planned cruelty. Sure that Anastasia had been poisoned by court enemies, Ivan started a time of terror against anyone who had ever said anything against his beloved first wife, even for small court mistakes years before. The mental effect of Anastasia's death on Ivan seems to have been huge. Instead of normal sadness, he became sure enemies were everywhere, planning against him and anyone he loved. This crazy fear, mixed with his already strong taste for cruelty, created a circle of violence that got totally out of control. Ivan's later wives suffered under his impossible demands and violent jealousy. He wanted total love and obedience, while also thinking they were planning against him with made-up lovers or political enemies. The mental pressure was so bad that several wives reportedly went crazy, becoming unable to move or speak or hurting themselves. When proof came out about his fifth wife's relationships before marriage, Ivan's reaction was so extreme that even his cruelty-tough court people were shocked. Instead of just killing her, he made long torture plans to force her to tell every detail of her past, then used that to shame her in public before finally killing her. The process of breaking his fifth wife was stretched out for months, while Ivan seemed to enjoy every step of her mental collapse. He made her write long stories of her past love life, then had those papers read out loud at court parties while she had to listen. The mix of public shame and constant fear of death turned her into a broken person. Ivan's most famous act of personal violence happened in 1581 when he killed his own son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of uncontrollable anger. Historians still argue about exactly what happened, but most trusted stories say the Tsar beat his pregnant daughter-in-law so badly that she lost the baby, leading to a fight with his son that ended with Ivan hitting the young man in the head with his pointed metal staff. The prince died 3 days later from his wounds, leaving Ivan without a good heir and the Russian royal line in confusion. But instead of feeling sorry for this worst act of family violence, Ivan seemed mostly worried about what it meant for politics. He right away started planning to marry again, hoping to have another son even though he was in his 50s and getting weak. The death of his son seemed to make Ivan's mind worse. His last years had times of religious craziness mixed with bursts of violence worse than anything before. He would spend days praying and not eating, asking God to forgive his sins, then come out to do new cruel things worse than ever. In these final years, Ivan's sexual actions became stranger and more hunting-like. Unable to get noble wives the normal way because everyone knew he killed wives, he started keeping a large group of young women taken from all over his empire. These women disappeared into special rooms in the Kremlin and were never seen again, leading to many stories about torture rooms and killing places hidden in the palace. Court workers who lived through Ivan's rule later talked about living in constant fear where no one, no matter how high or how loyal, felt safe from the Tsar's sudden violence. Even his closest advisors and most loyal helpers lived scared that some small mistake or moment of anger could mean torture and death. The mental ways Ivan used to control his court became part of his gift to Russian ruling. His use of sudden violence, his habit of destroying whole families to stop future enemies, and his skill at making people join in terrible acts out of fear all became normal tools of Russian government that would affect the country for hundreds of years. Ivan's death in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, brought instant relief across the Russian Empire, but his effect on Russian people lasted a long time. He had shown that total power in the hands of someone with real mental problems could create ruling systems based completely on fear and cruelty. The ways of controlling people through planned violence that Ivan started would be learned and copied by later Russian rulers from Peter the Great to Stalin. His rule set the idea that Russian czars could do almost any level of cruelty to their own people without real punishment. More widely, Ivan the Terrible's life is history's clearest example of how medieval kingship's mix of total power and God's blessing could create monsters when given to mentally sick people. His story shows that unchecked power doesn't just ruin people. It can completely destroy the basic human ability to care about others and know right from wrong. From the mountains and forests of medieval Wallachia comes maybe the most mentally complicated person in our list of royal evil, Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, and to stories as the real person behind Count Dracula. Ruling Wallachia in 3 different times between 1456 and 1476, Vlad turned planned cruelty from a simple tool of ruling into a detailed art that scared even the violence-accepting 15th century. Vlad's change from hopeful young prince to history's most famous sadist started with childhood experiences that would have hurt anyone's mind. At age 11, he and his younger brother Radu were taken as prisoners by the Ottoman Empire as part of a deal to make sure their father stayed loyal to the Sultan. For 6 years, from 11 to 17, Vlad lived at the Ottoman court in Adrianople, where he learned both fancy culture and planned cruelty. The Ottoman Empire was at its strongest and most cultured, but it was also a place where public killings, where big shows and torture was seen as needed for good ruling. While most prisoners either got used to being captured or were broken by it, Vlad seemed to learn the lessons of political fear while growing a burning hate for his captors. Old writings say he spent his teen years studying Ottoman ways of mental warfare, clearly planning to use these same methods against his enemies when he got back to Wallachia. The young prince's time seeing Ottoman cruelty was complete and thorough. He watched large killings done with perfect planning, saw torture meant to get both information and public surrender, and learned how fear could be stronger than armies or money. But unlike his brother Radu, who later changed to Islam and fit into Ottoman life, Vlad stayed mentally against his captors while copying their ways. This made a dangerous mix in his mind: deep knowledge of fancy cruelty plus burning anger, and a need for revenge that would finally hurt not just his enemies but his whole land. When Vlad finally took the Wallachian throne in 1456, his first actions showed how completely his personality had been changed by his years as a prisoner and watching Ottoman ways. Instead of just killing political enemies the usual medieval way, he started trying new methods meant to cause the most physical pain and mental fear for anyone who might rebel. His favorite way, which gave him his history name, was impalement, pushing a sharpened wooden stake through a victim's body so death came slowly over hours or even days. But Vlad's new idea wasn't just the method, but how big and planned he made it. Where earlier rulers might impale a few enemies as warnings, Vlad made whole forests of stakes around his capital city. People who saw wrote about thousands of victims shown at the same time as rotting warnings to anyone thinking of going against him. Foreign visitors wrote home about the smell of rotting bodies that covered Wallachia like a cloud you could see from far away, and that always reminded people what happened if they upset their prince. The most mentally upsetting part of Vlad's rule was how he seemed to really enjoy watching torture and killing. Unlike other cruel rulers who gave these jobs to workers, Vlad made sure to be there for every impalement, often standing where he could see his victims' faces as they died. Old writings say he ate meals outside among freshly impaled prisoners, seeming to enjoy his food more with the screams of the dying. This wasn't just political scaring, though it worked for that too. Vlad seemed to need the sight and sound of human pain for his own mental happiness. He would ask foreign visitors to eat with him at these awful dinners, watching their faces with clear fun as they tried to stay calm while surrounded by torture and death. Vlad's planned cruelty went beyond political enemies to include anyone who didn't meet his rules for how society should act. In 1459, he invited all the beggars, sick, and disabled people in his capital to a big party, promising food and a place to stay for a church holiday. When hundreds of the weakest people in society were inside a big hall, Vlad had the building set on fire, burning hundreds of people alive, whose only crime was being poor or sick. His reason for this mass killing showed the huge, crazy ideas that now ruled his thinking. Vlad said that by getting rid of the poor and sick, he was cleaning Wallachia of sin and weakness, making a stronger land that could better fight foreign enemies. This wasn't normal medieval kindness or even usual royal not caring about suffering. It was planned killing of a whole group, hidden as making society better. Vlad's sexual actions were just as awful and showed the same need for violence and fear that was in all his personal relationships. Unlike other medieval kings, whose attacks on women came mostly from wanting sex or control, Vlad seemed to need cruelty and fear to feel any sexual pleasure. Many old writings say he would force noble families to give him daughters for sex, then torture the women to death while their families watched from prison. The mental pain to the victims' families seemed as important to him as the physical attack on the women. He would often keep parents or brothers and sisters locked up just so they could watch their loved ones suffer for a long time, seeming to find their pain as exciting as the sexual acts. One especially upsetting story from 1460 tells about Vlad's treatment of captured Ottoman soldiers during one of his many fights with the empire. Instead of just killing them as war prisoners the normal medieval way, he had them slowly skinned alive while making their surviving friends watch. Those who lived through the skinning were then impaled, making a planned series of horror meant to break the minds of later prisoners. This planned way of mental fighting was something new in medieval war. While torture and killing prisoners had always happened in war, Vlad's ways were made specially to cause pain that would last beyond the moment and hurt whole families, towns, and cultures. He was fighting not just enemy soldiers, but the mental health of whole groups of people. Vlad's rule reached its most famous height during his big war with the Ottoman Empire in the 1460s. When Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, attacked Wallachia with a huge army, Vlad answered not with normal fighting, but with a plan of pure mental terror that became famous across Europe and the Muslim world. He moved back ahead of the Ottoman army, leaving behind land made on purpose to break the spirit of anyone chasing him. Every village was burned, every well poisoned with dead bodies, and every crossroads covered with forests of impaled prisoners. The mental effect was so bad that the Sultan's army, even though much bigger than Vlad's, finally turned back instead of keeping going through this made-up hell. The most famous moment of this plan was when Vlad made a forest of 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners outside the city of Targovist. People who saw wrote about a scene so awful that Sultan Mehmed himself, a man tough from years of war and winning lands, reportedly turned away instead of going into the city. Ottoman writers said soldiers cried and threw up at the sight, with some running away instead of going on through what they called hell on earth. But maybe the scariest part of Vlad's personality was his clear belief that his cruel acts were right for religious and moral reasons. He always said his mass killings and planned torture were needed to clean Wallachia of badness and sin, seeing himself as God's tool on earth doing God's will. This big idea of himself let him make his violence worse without any mental limit. Since any act, no matter how awful, could be explained as serving a higher spiritual goal, Vlad had made a religious reason that turned his sadistic joy into holy work, making his cruelty have no end in size or strength. His personal relationships showed this total inability to have normal human feelings. His marriage to a Hungarian noblewoman was reportedly full of constant fear for her and cruel mental games from him. When she finally tried to escape his control by jumping from a castle tower, Vlad showed no sadness or regret, but seemed amused by what he called her weakness and lack of faith in his holy mission. Vlad's treatment of his own children, when he had any, followed the same pattern of mental control and casual cruelty that was in all his relationships. He seemed unable to understand love, loyalty, or trust as anything but ways to control people, leaving even his closest family always scared of his sudden violence. The end of Vlad's rule came in 1476 when he was killed by his own nobles during a battle with Ottoman forces. His death brought relief across Eastern Europe, but the mental scars from his rule lasted for many years. Wallachia stayed connected to supernatural horror and extreme violence in people's minds long after he died, helping give the area a reputation as a place where normal human rules didn't apply. Vlad the Impaler is maybe the clearest example of medieval royal sadism taken as far as it could go. Unlike other cruel rulers whose violence had clear political reasons, Vlad's cruelty seemed to exist mostly for itself, growing bigger until it destroyed everything around him. His rules showed what could happen when total power was given to someone who had lost all ability for normal human caring. The Dracula legend that grew from Vlad's real history captures something true about who he was, the picture of someone who feeds on human pain, who cannot live without causing suffering, and who turns everything he touches into a copy of his own mental darkness. In this way, the vampire story may be history's best way to describe what total power can become when given to a truly disturbed person. Our trip through medieval royal evil ends with Henry VIII of England, whose rule from 1509 to 1547 turned royal marriage from a holy promise into a system of legal killing. Though technically at the end of the medieval time, Henry's actions are the final result of hundreds of years of royal going too far, showing what happened when medieval ideas of total power mixed with smarter Renaissance politics and personal feelings. Henry's change from the golden prince of European culture into a wife-killing tyrant is one of history's clearest examples of how power can ruin even people who seemed good. The young king who took the throne at 18 was tall and strong, very educated, good at art, and seemed truly devoted to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Yet within 30 years, he had made a new national church, changed English law, and set the rule that queens could be legally killed for not doing what their husband wanted. The mental reasons for Henry's final monster actions can be traced to his obsession with having a son and proving God approved of his rule. Unlike many medieval kings who accepted that the crown could pass through daughters, Henry convinced himself that God specially wanted him to have a real son as proof God liked his rule. This belief would finally excuse any cruelty to get male heirs. When Catherine of Aragon couldn't give him the son he needed after almost 20 years of marriage, Henry's disappointment slowly turned into something much more dangerous, a belief that he was right to destroy anyone standing between him and his family goals. This wasn't just smart politics, but a real belief that his personal wants were exactly what God wanted for England. His chase of Anne Boleyn showed the patient planning that would mark his later relationships with women. Henry courted Anne for almost 7 years, using every power of the crown to pressure her into his bed while working at the same time to cancel his marriage to Catherine. When Anne kept saying no to sex without marriage, Henry showed he would break the English church, go against the Pope, and risk civil war rather than accept any woman saying no to him. But Henry's treatment of Anne after they married showed how fast his strong chase could turn into cold control and finally plans to kill. The man who had changed the world to have her became totally uncaring about her safety as soon as she didn't give him the son he demanded. When Anne lost their second baby in 1536, Henry right away started planning to get rid of her. The made-up charges against Anne Boleyn created a legal and mental plan that Henry would use again and again. He made impossible rules for how a queen should act, then later called normal things crimes if they didn't meet those rules. Anne was accused of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother, on days when court records clearly showed she was either pregnant, recovering from having a baby, or far away from the men she supposedly met. The proof against Anne was so clearly fake that even Henry's own helpers quietly said it made no sense. Yet the king's control of English law and court rules was so good that Anne was found guilty and killed, setting the rule that royal wives existed only as long as their husband wanted and could be removed by legal killing whenever they became useless or annoying. This wasn't just normal medieval cruel ruling, but something more planned, the on-purpose destruction of any law or moral rule stopping royal actions toward women. Henry had basically made wife-killing legal by dressing it up in court rules and religious excuses. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, died giving birth 13 days after finally giving the son Henry had wanted for so many years. Even this sad event showed Henry's basic inability to feel normal human sadness. Instead of feeling bad for Jane's sacrifice, Henry seemed mostly happy that she had proved his belief in his special destiny by giving him Prince Edward. When court people tried to comfort him for his loss, he reportedly pushed away their kindness, saying God had finally rewarded him. His patience and faithfulness, the speed with which Henry moved to find a fourth wife after Jane's death showed how completely he had turned royal marriage into a cold, mechanical process made only to serve his political and personal needs. Within months of Jane's funeral, he was already making plans to marry Anne of Cleves, a German princess chosen mainly for her possible help in making strong friendships with other European countries. When the political situation changed and the marriage to Anne of Cleves became inconvenient, Henry's actions showed how completely he had stopped treating wives like real people and started seeing them only as tools he could throw away. He simply said that Anne was too ugly for him to sleep with her, then scared her into agreeing to a divorce by quietly threatening her with the same kind of fake trial and murder that had killed Anne Boleyn. Anne of Cleves, showing great cleverness and a strong will to stay alive, agreed to the divorce and took a comfortable life away from court instead of fighting Henry and risking his growing wild and violent moods toward wives who upset him. Her survival gave her the nickname in history of the luckiest of Henry's wives, a title that says a lot about what being married to Henry VIII usually meant. But it was Henry's treatment of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, that showed most clearly how deeply cruel he had become in his heart and how he had completely thrown away any moral rules in how he treated women. Catherine was about 19 when Henry married her, a young woman whose earlier love experiences had been completely normal teenage relationships right for a girl her age and place in society. Henry, now in his 50s and terribly fat, seemed to believe that his young wife should feel only thanks for his attention and total love for him alone. When proof came out about Catherine's relationships before marriage, Henry's reaction was so wild that even his tough and violent court people were truly shocked by how mean he was. Instead of just ordering Catherine's execution, Henry made new laws on purpose to make her suffer as much as possible in her mind before she died. He made it a crime going back in time for a woman who was not a virgin to marry the king without telling her. Full past love history then used this new law to say Catherine was guilty for not telling about relationships that had happened years before she even met Henry. The process of destroying Catherine Howard was made long on purpose over many months to hurt her mind more. Henry kept her locked in her rooms while people questioned her again and again about every private detail of her teenage love life. He made her write down her own confessions about her past, then used those papers to shame her in public before she was finally killed. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, survived only by showing total thinking and feeling obedience to his growing crazy and violent personality. She lived every day knowing that any word or action that could look like criticism or wanting to be free might end with the same fake trial and murder that had killed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The mind damage from Henry's planned cruelty to wives went far beyond his direct victims and hurt all of English society. Noble families became afraid to give daughters for royal marriages. They understood that being close to Henry's favor was more likely to bring death than honor. The king's treatment of queens sent a clear message about how all English women could expect powerful men to treat them. Henry's later years were full of growing body weakness and mind problems that made him dangerous to everyone around him, not just his wives. His court people lived in constant fear, never knowing if they would meet the happy king who had once been the bright star of Renaissance. Kings or the crazy tyrant who saw enemies and betrayal in every look or word. The king's last months were filled with pain from infected leg wounds that would not heal, maybe made worse by diabetes and other sicknesses from his great fatness. But instead of making him kinder, the body pain seemed to make his cruelty and distrust worse. He kept planning new marriages and killings almost until he died in 1547. Henry VII's rule shows the worst of old royal too much, proving how total power could turn even the most basic human relationships into tools of control and violence. His planned destruction of 6 marriages by divorce, ending the marriage, and fake trials that ended in murder set examples for royal behavior that would affect English kings for many years. More widely, Henry's story shows how old ideas of kings chosen by God and total power could be used with new Renaissance political tricks to make new kinds of planned cruelty. His rule marked the end of any real limits on royal power over people's lives, especially women, and set the idea that law itself could be changed to excuse any amount of personal meanness. The effects of Henry's marriages went far beyond England to change European ideas about royal power and the treatment of women for the whole early modern time. His example made other kings believe that their personal wants, no matter how harmful or wrong, could be turned into government policy and God's command. As our trip through the darkest parts of old monarchy comes to an end, we must think about what these stories teach us about power, human nature, and the societies that made and allowed such terrible behavior. The kings we met tonight were not strange accidents or rare cases. They were the natural results of a government system that put no real limits on royal actions while giving every reason for too much and cruelty. Old kingship was built on the main idea that kings were chosen by God and therefore above normal moral rules. This God-based idea mixed with the real fact of total power over life and death made places where troubled minds could grow strong without anyone stopping or fixing them. The very shape of old monarchy chose people who were okay with having total control over other humans. The things that let these rulers do their terrible acts were planned and part of the system, not just personal. courts full of people who only said yes and needed the king so they could not speak against royal actions. Legal systems made to help the king, not to bring justice, and church groups that gave God excuses for anything done by God's chosen people on earth. Maybe the most upsetting is how these king's people often joined in the ruler's cruelty willingly, either by helping directly or by quietly accepting it. The same nobles who might secretly hate a king's treatment of women would openly go to killings and cheer fake murders when their own lives were not in danger. Old society had made careful ways to make even the worst royal actions seem normal and okay. The mind types that come from these history stories share upsetting same points. Very big opinion of themselves, no ability to feel for others' pain, need for total control over personal relationships, and habit of seeing any saying no as personal attack that deserved the worst punishment. These were not just mean men who happened to be kings, but people whose minds were completely shaped by having unlimited power from young ages. The effects of royal badness went far beyond direct victims to hurt whole societies. When kings regularly broke the most basic moral and law rules, it made cultures where violence and taking advantage became normal parts of everyday life. The example set by kings changed how nobles, officials, and finally normal people acted, making growing circles of abuse and cruelty. Women, as the easiest targets of royal too much, suffered way more under systems that saw them as things to own, use, and throw away as men wanted. But the harm was not only to direct victims. The making normal of violence against women by the highest people in the land sent messages about women's worth and men's rights that changed gender relationships all through society. The God parts of royal badness need special looking at. These kings did not usually see themselves as against Christianity, but as its most loyal servants doing God's will. Their power to turn personal cruelty into God duty shows how God ideas can be twisted to excuse any amount of human pain when mixed with total government power. The new law ideas made by these kings to excuse their actions had lasting effects on systems that went far beyond their own rules. Henry VII's new meaning of treason to include letting the king down, Ivan the Terrible's use of police as planned terror, and Vlad the Impaler's turning justice into public shows all set examples that changed their law systems for hundreds of years. Money reasons also played big parts in letting royal badness happen. Old kings controlled huge wealth that let them keep complicated systems of watching, punishing, and giving rewards made to make sure people did what they wanted. The gathering of money in royal hands meant that going against a king's actions, no matter how crazy, could mean total money ruin for whole families and areas. The world parts of old royal actions made government and war problems that often had terrible results for normal people. When kings like John of England or Philip Augustus of France let personal craziness control outside policy, the fights that came made pain on sizes that made their own cruelties look small. Yet maybe the most important lesson from these history stories is how fast normal civilized societies could get used to extreme cruelty when it was shown as right royal power. The same people who made great art, books, and buildings also gave happy crowds for public killings and big torture shows. This getting used to it says something deeply worrying about human nature and how groups work. When power people show and reward cruel actions, whole people can learn to find fun and even right feeling in others' pain. Old time shows that civilization is much weaker than we usually think. The final end of old monarchy did not happen because rulers suddenly got better morals or people got smarter, but because changing money and war situations made total royal power harder to keep. The rise of buying classes, paid armies, and other power centers slowly broke the bases that had held up unlimited royal rights. However, the mind and culture patterns made during hundreds of years of old royal too much did not go away with rules kings. Modern history has again and again shown that the same mixes of total power, idea excuses, and people going along that let old royal badness happen can come back in different government forms with just as bad results. The study of old royal badness is therefore not just history fun, but a warning about the always possible chance for human groups to let and make normal extreme cruelty when right system limits and moral teaching are missing. These stories remind us that civilization needs constant watching and hard work to keep, while coming before The old time, no talk of royal badness would be full without looking at Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known in history as Caligula, whose short rule from 37 to 41 CE made patterns for King too much that would affect kings for hundreds of years. His 4-year rule showed how fast total power could turn even a hopeful young ruler into something that went past the edges of normal human actions. Caligula's early life seemed to promise greatness instead of shame. Born into the ruler family, he spent his childhood with the armies on the German border, where soldiers called him Little Boots for the small army shoes he wore. The young prince was loved by the soldiers and seemed to show the war skills that Romans liked most. When he became ruler after his great uncle Tiberius, the Roman people cheered what they thought would be a return to the good days of Augustus. The first months of Caligula's rule seemed to prove this hope right. He freed political prisoners, brought back public voting, and gave big money gifts to the Praetorian Guard and Roman people. But this good start hid mind problems that would soon turn the Roman Empire into a place of unthinkable cruelty and sex too much. The change started after Caligula got a very bad sickness in late 37, maybe encephalitis or another sickness that hurt his brain. When he got better, people close to him saw worrying changes in how he acted. The young man who had seemed like a normal ruler started doing things that shocked even the used-to-everything Roman rich people. Caligula's sex once became famous all over the old world for how big and how little they cared for any moral or law lines. He started taking the wives of senators and other high people by using his power, often making their husbands watch these attacks as forced viewers. But unlike other rulers whose sex violence seemed from want or power over politics, Caligula seemed pushed by a need to show his total power over every part of Roman life. His treatment of his own sisters went past lines that even the not-strict Roman high people found shocking. Caligula had wrong and shocking love relationships with his sisters, but gave special care to Drusilla, whom he treated as if she were his wife and not his sister. He showed up with her at public events, gave her honors usually only for queens, and is said to have planned to name her as his heir, completely skipping the male people in the ruler family. When Drusilla died in 38, Caligula's sadness took forms that showed how deep his mind problem was. He said she was a goddess and started a religion to worship her, with temples and women priests. More worrying, he is said to have kept her body and would talk to her dead body as if she were alive, asking for her help on ruler matters and getting upset when she did not answer. Caligula's belief that he was a god, which started maybe as show for politics, slowly took over his whole mind. He started showing up in public dressed as different gods, ordered statues of himself with god signs, and demanded that all Roman people worship him as a living god. This was not just the normal ruler-god religion that had started under Augustus, but something much more mindsick. The ruler started making complicated sex plans that mixed his god-crazy ideas with his need to control others completely. He would dress as gods like Jupiter or Neptune while doing rape and torture, seeming to believe that being a god made any action okay, no matter how mean or wrong. These times often happened in temples or other holy places, adding wrong against religion to sex violence. One of the most famous cases of Caligula's sex cruelty was how he treated Caesania, a woman who later became his fourth wife. Instead of asking her to marry in a normal way, Caligula took her from her husband, put her through shaming attacks, then kept her under his power for months before choosing to marry her, even after their marriage. He would give her to other men for his fun, seeming to like her shame and lowering. Caligula's way with marriage itself showed his complete saying no to normal human love. He married and divorced wives for no real reason, sometimes for tiny things like finding their talk boring or not liking how they looked in some light. One wife was said to be divorced on their wedding day because Caligula thought she looked too happy, which he saw as not enough fear of his god self. The ruler's sex violence went beyond his close people to include any woman who got his eye all over the Roman Empire. He would order local rulers to send him the wives and daughters of important people for his fun, treating these takings as normal uses of ruler power. The mind hurt on families all over the empire was terrible, as no one could feel safe from the ruler's random wants. But maybe most worrying was how Caligula used sex as a tool of government control. He would make senators offer their own wives and daughters to him, making them talk about prices and make plans like they ran a bad house. This was not just sex-taking, but a planned way to destroy the pride and self-worth of the Roman rich people. The ruler's cruelties got worse during fighter games and public shows, which he turned into chances for big sex violence. He put guilty people through terrible shows with wild animals in the arena, ordered big group sex with slaves and prisoners, and made important people do low sex acts as public fun. Caligula's rule of sex fear ended in 41 when a group of Praetorian guards led by Cassius Chaerea killed him in a tunnel under the ruler palace. The plan included senators, army officers, and even some of his own freed slaves, showing how completely he had made every part of Roman life hate him. The time after Caligula's killing showed the lasting harm his rule had done to Roman government life. The Senate really thought about bringing back the Republic instead of risking another ruler monster, while the Praetorian Guard's part in picking rulers became forever set. Most importantly, the examples Caligula set for ruler sex actions would affect his followers for hundreds of years. Following Caligula's pattern for ruler too much, Marcus Aurelius Commodus ruled Rome from 180 to 192 CE, turning the empire into his own playground of violence and sex badness. While his father, Marcus Aurelius, had been a thinking ruler who lived stoic good ways, Commodus showed the complete ruining of ruler power when given to someone who saw cruelty as fun. Unlike Caligula, whose crazy seemed to come fast after sickness, Commodus showed worrying signs from early childhood that should have warned people he was not fit for power. Even as a young prince, he showed strange joy in watching fighter fights and public killings, often getting clearly excited by seeing violence and death. When Commodus became ruler at 18, he right away started turning the ruler court into a place for more and more fancy sex and violent shows. He ordered the building of private fighting places inside the palace area where he could put on fighter contests, wild animal hunts, and big killings for his own fun and that of carefully picked guests. But Commodus once went beyond just watching. He started fighting himself in fighter games, though in ways that made sure he won and stayed safe. These were not fair fights, but fancy plays made to show the ruler's supposed strength, while feeding his need for violence and public love. The ruler's sex ways became mixed with his love of violence in ways that scared even the not easily shocked Roman rich people. He kept a private group of fighters and friends, picked for their power to take hard treatment, mixing violence with personal fun. These love ties were not based on liking or even want, but on Commodus' need to control people who showed body strength and bravery. Commodus' treatment of his lover women showed the mean side of his sex. He made them fight in cruel contests, sometimes deadly, using the ones who lived to feed his twisted feeling of power and fun. These contests were not just fun, but fancy games that mixed sex excitement with violence and death. The ruler's marriage to Brutia Crispina showed how his violent wants ruined even supposed normal love ties. Instead of treating her as queen, Commodus put his wife through constant shame and attack, making her watch his sex with others and join in low shows made to break her spirit. When Crispina was later accused of cheating, probably with made-up proof, Commodus' answer showed how deep his cruelty went. Instead of just ordering her killed, he sent her to the island of Capri, where she went through fancy tortures made to make her pain last for months before her final death. Commodus' rule got to its worst with his choice to rename Rome itself after him, calling the city Colonia Commodiana. This was not just crazy self-love, but part of a full plan to remake Roman life after his violent dreams. He renamed the months of the year after his different names, made all people take fighter training, and started new holidays to celebrate violence and sex too much. The ruler's last years were full of growing crazy fear and violence as he started to see plans against him everywhere. His answer was to make his rule of fear worse, ordering big killings for the smallest reasons, and turning the ruler court into a place where living depended completely on the ruler's quick mood. Commodus met his end in 192 when he was killed by a plan that included his lover Marcia, his room servant Eclectus, and the Praetorian leader Letus. Importantly, the plan was started not by government ideas, but by the planners' fear that they would soon be victims of the ruler's more and more random violence. Our earlier look at King John's rule only touched the top of his planned sex attacks and government cruelty. Looking deeper at old writings shows more patterns of actions that prove how completely he had left any idea of moral rules in how he treated people. One of the most worrying parts of John's rule was his use of prisoners. especially women prisoners, as tools for both government control and personal fun. Old fighting often meant taking prisoners to make sure people kept treaties. But John twisted this habit into a way to get victims for his sex wants. When John took enemy castles or made rebel nobles give up, he would often ask for their women family as promises of future good behavior. These prisoners came from noble families to middle age, would be taken to royal homes where they basically disappeared from history books. Their endings unknown, but easy to guess from John's known ways of acting. The planned way John took prisoners shows careful thinking instead of quick cruelty. Royal papers show that he kept careful lists of women prisoners, writing their family ties, ages, and government worth. This was not random taking, but planned using made to get the most government control and personal fun. Old writings also show John's habit of using marriage talks as chances for sex attack. When outside princes or nobles wanted marriages with English noble women, John would say he had to check the future brides himself, often keeping them at court for long times during which they went through bad treatment and using. These fake marriage talks helped John in many ways. They gave him victims while pretending it was normal royal work. They let him shame rival nobles by hurting their women family, and they made government mess that he could use for his own good. The mind hurt of John's actions on noble families all over England was terrible and lasted long. Many families started saying no to sending their daughters to court for any reason, choosing to lose royal favor instead of risking their loved one's safety. This big fear made a feeling of doubt and hate that hurt John's power to rule well. John's treatment of church women was especially shocking even for old times. His attacks on nuns and abbey leaders were not just breaking church rules, but stood for attacks on the whole way of old Christian life. By going after women who had given their lives to God, John was showing his belief that no person or group could stop his power. The government results of John's sex violence went far beyond England's land. His name for bad sex actions made marriage deals with other countries almost impossible, taking away England of important European friends. Outside, nobles did not want to make deals with a king they could not trust to follow even the simplest people rules. Maybe most importantly, John's actions set examples for royal ways that would affect English kings for many years. His planned use of sex violence as a government tool, his readiness to break church-safe places, and his total not caring for normal marriage rules all grew the lines of what kings could do without punishment. Our earlier look at Edward II's rule looked mostly at his love ties with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, but the full size of his personal and government failures shows a more complicated pattern of wrong that went far beyond his famous male favorites. Edward's failure to separate private wants and public work showed in many ways. Beyond his well-known ties, he filled his court with a whole group of young men picked mostly for their good looks instead of their government skill, making a feeling that shocked even the pretty okay-with-things old nobles. Old writings tell of royal parties where Edward would openly touch his favorites while doing government work, seeming not to know the government harm such shows were doing. Outside helpers wrote home telling of scenes that seemed more fit for a bad house than a royal court, with the King of England acting in ways that hurt his power and respect. The money cost of Edward's favorites went far beyond the gifts and high places he gave to people like Gaveston and Despenser. He kept a big court home made mostly to hold his personal fun, paying hundreds of servants, fun makers, and friends whose only skill was making or looking good for the king. These costs came at a time when England had serious war and money problems that needed strong royal care and smart money use. Instead, Edward was making the royal money empty to pay for what was really a fancy male love house hidden as a royal court. Edward's not caring for his wife Isabella went beyond simple not loving in marriage to active cruelty, made to shame her in front of all European nobles. He would make her come to parties honoring his male favorites, make her show public respect to men who were openly sleeping with her husband, and put her through different kinds of mind torture made to break her spirit. Isabella's final fight back was not just using chance in government, but the hopeless act of a woman who had suffered years of planned shame and attack. Her love with Roger Mortimer was both personal freedom and government need, giving her the feeling strength and army help needed to fight Edward's ruining rule. The bigger effect of Edward's rule on English government life was deep and lasted long. His complete putting royal work under personal set dangerous examples for how kings could act while still keeping seeming rightness. Future kings would remember that Edward had done years of crazy actions before finally paying for them. Edward's death in Berkeley Castle, whether by killing or natural reasons, became a sign of the final cost of royal too much self-love. The king who had believed his personal wants made right any government cost died alone and left behind, a warning story about the limits of total power when used without wisdom or control. The mind patterns that ruled Philip Augustus rule need deeper, looking as they show how personal hurt and crazy wants could twist the thinking of even government-successful kings. Philip's wins in growing French land and making royal power stronger came at huge personal cost to himself and people around him. Philip's crazy love with Isabella of Hainault seems to come from his childhood times of government trouble and family wrong. Crowned at age 15 after his father's death, Philip grew up in a court where government marriages were often ended, where being loyal was short, and where feeling ties were seen as dangerous weak spots. His strong focus on Isabella may have been a try to make the steady, loving tie that had been missing from his childhood, but his complete not accepting normal marriage lines turned what might have been real love into a choking owning that finally destroyed the very tie he was trying to keep. Old writings tell of Philip's daily life during his marriage to Isabella as turning completely around watching and controlling what she did. He would ask servants about her talks, look at her letters, and get very angry when she showed interest in anything or anyone but him. This was not love, but a kind of mind prison. Philip's treatment of Ingeborg of Denmark shows the depths of his feeling trouble when his dreams hit real life. His fast and strong saying no to his second wife shows that he had made impossible hopes based on his perfect memories of Isabella, then punished Ingeborg for not matching these dreams. The 20-year fight over his marriage to Ingeborg was not just a friend-country problem, but a showing of Philip's complete not accepting that other people had their own wants and wills, his readiness to let his whole kingdom suffer under church punishment instead of giving in on his marriage shows how completely his personal crazies had taken over his government thinking. Philip's tie with his son Louis shows same patterns of crazy control going to his job as father. Not able to accept that his heir might grow his own thoughts and ties, Philip put the young prince under watching and tricks that may have helped cause Louis's early death. The bigger effect of Philip's mind sickness on French government life was big. His treatment of queens set examples for royal marriage that said complete giving in and total control, patterns that would affect French kings for many years. The full size of Ivan the Terrible's rule of fear goes far beyond the single bad acts we already looked at. Old Russian and outside writings show a planned program of mind war made to break the spirit of his whole empire and turn Russia into a picture of his own sick mind. Ivan's making of the Oprichniki, his personal guard group, is one of history's most advanced tries in government. Paid terror, these black-dressed riders, who carried dog heads and brooms as signs of their job to find and clean away wrong loyalty, worked outside all law rules and answered only to Ivan's own orders. The Oprichniki were not just top soldiers or police, but people in what was really a god group for Ivan's worship. They took special promises of loyalty that were more important than all other duties, including family ties and Christian good ways, really turning them into parts of Ivan's will instead of their own people. Ivan used the Oprichniki to do tests in big mind tricks that went far beyond normal army or government pushing down. They would surround whole towns, split families from each other, then put the people through fancy rituals of shame and fear made to break group ties and make total depending on Ivan's kindness. These actions often meant making families watch or do acts of cruelty that broke them feeling-wise, making husbands and wives choose who would die first, or making church leaders ruin their own churches. The goal was not just to punish thought disloyalty, but to destroy the mind bases of group life all through Russia. Ivan's treatment of prisoners during his different war fights showed same patterns of planned cruelty made to make lasting mind hurt, instead of just killing. Taken enemies, he put them through long and cruel punishments meant to break their spirit that made them feel the most pain while staying awake as long as possible. Old writings tell of Ivan himself watching torture times that could last for days with the Tsar seeming to get real. joy from his victims' pain while also writing careful notes about their answers to different kinds of pain. This was not mean in the normal way, but something close to science tests with human pain. The god sides of Ivan's cruelty need special care, as he always said God okayed his worst acts. He kept around him twisted monks and priests who gave God excuses for any level of mean, making a wrong kind of orthodox Christianity that turned killing and torture into acts of worship. Ivan's later years were full of more and more fancy rituals of saying sorry and making up that changed with times of never-before violence. He would spend weeks in monasteries, not eating and praying for forgiveness for his sins, then come out to do new bad acts that were worse than everything before. These up and down times suggest a kind of feeling need for violence that was outside his own control. The effect of Ivan's rule on Russian government life was lasting and deep. His ways of ruling through fear, his planned breaking of normal group ties, and his turning of church power into a tool of cruelty, all became forever parts of Russian government ways that would affect the country for hundreds of years. The kings we looked at tonight did not work alone, but made system groups that lived after their own rules and affected government growth across Europe for hundreds of years. Their new ways in planned using of cruelty, the twisting of law and religion to excuse personal too much, and the making of court lives that made extreme actions normal, all became part of the forever effects of old monarchy, the law examples set by rulers like Henry VII. And Ivan the Terrible changed at the root the tie between kings and people all through Europe. Henry's new meaning of treason, to include any action that let the king down, made a law way that made saying bad about royal actions may be deadly. While Ivan's use of police as planned terror set the idea that law systems could be used as weapons for government control. These law new things were not just short helps that died with their makers, but became built into the system shapes of monarchy itself. Future rulers got not just thrones and money, but law ways that made extreme royal actions technically okay and really impossible to stop. The god sides of royal badness also had lasting system results. When kings like Philip Augustus and Ivan the Terrible successfully twisted church people into giving God excuses for their cruelties, they set examples for the putting church power under government power that would affect European Christianity for many years. The court lives made by these bad kings proved especially strong in shaping rich people actions all through Europe. When kings made cruelty popular, when royal good treatment depended on joining in or accepting extreme actions, and when living needed helping in bad acts, whole rich classes learned to make normal and even cheer mean actions. These life changes did not go away when single bad rulers died, but became part of the people cloth of European rich life. The everyday cruelty, the plan taking advantage of weak people, and the complete not caring for moral rules that marked old royal courts all became normal parts of high people actions that lasted well into the new time. The money systems that helped royal too much also made lasting system effects. The gathering of money and things needed to keep fancy systems of watching, punishing, and giving rewards needed basic changes in how old groups planned work, taxes, and things sharing. These money changes, first made to help single kings' wants for fancy things and control, finally became forever parts of European government money ways that outlived the special rulers who made them. The middle running systems, the paid worker groups, and the always armies that let royal bad rule all became needed parts of new country power. Maybe most importantly, the mind tricks first used by old bad rulers set patterns for government control that would be learned and made better by later mean groups. The use of not-know-when violence to make giving in, the planned breaking of group ties to stop group fighting back, and the twisting of ideas to excuse any level of cruelty all became normal tools of mean ruling. The world sides of royal badness also had lasting results for European friend country and war life. When kings regularly broke the most basic moral and law rules in their treatment of people, it set examples for same actions in world ties that helped make hundreds of years of war and friend country trouble. The making normal of extreme actions by royal example affected not just close court lives, but whole people's understanding of what was okay action by power people. When kings showed that power made okay any level of cruelty, it made falling effects all through people levels that affected how nobles treated farmers, how husbands treated wives, and how owners treated workers. These life patterns proved amazingly strong, living through government changes, church fixes, and people changes that might have been thought to make kinder forms of power. The mind and system effects of old royal badness kept affecting European government life well into the new time. Understanding these long-time system results helps explain why free people groups have found it needed to make such fancy systems of checks and balances, rule limits, and law protections for single rights. The history time of not stopped royal power proved that humans cannot be trusted with total power over others, no matter their first plans or seeming skills. As we end our long trip through the darkest parts of old monarchy, we are left with deep questions about human nature, government power, and the groups we choose to make. The kings we met tonight are extreme examples of what happens when total power meets mind trouble, but their stories light up patterns that still matter for understanding new government and people problems. The most striking part of these history stories may be how fast-seeming civilized groups got used to extreme cruelty when it was shown as right power. The same people who made great churches, made beautiful lighted books, and made advanced law and God thinking systems also gave happy crowds for public torture and big killings. This getting used to it says something deeply worrying about human group mind that goes far beyond the old time. When power people keep showing cruel actions and reward people who join in or help such cruelty, whole people can clearly learn to find fun and even right feeling in others' pain. Yet, these dark stories also have examples of amazing bravery and fighting back that remind us of people's power for good growth even under the most crushing times. From single acts of saying no by victims who would not give in quietly to planned fighting groups that finally limited bad power to slow life changes that made extreme cruelty less okay in groups, we see proof that good growth is possible even in the darkest times. The system ways that finally limited royal power did not come by themselves, but were made through the added work of countless people who saw that not stopped power was basic danger to human respect and group steady. The law protections, government groups, and life rules that mark new free people groups all are answers to the history time of bad rule. Understanding this history helps explain why watching to protect free groups stays very important. The human wants toward ruling and giving in, the mind weak spots that make people open to bad power calls, and the system movements that can turn right power into crushing bad rule all stay working in today's politics. The tech and money changes that have happened since the old time have made new chances for both human freedom and planned crushing. While new groups have made better ways for limiting government power, they have also made new tech of watching and control that old bad rulers could hardly have dreamed. The job for today's groups is in using these new powers for human good while stopping their gathering in ways that might let new forms of planned cruelty. The history book says that this needs not just written law protections, but continuing life promised to values of human respect, single rights, and caring for each other. Maybe most importantly, these stories remind us that good growth is never promised and always stays weak. The space between civilization and wild, between right and bad rule, between caring and cruelty proves much smaller than we often think. Each new group must choose again whether to build on the good growth of the past or let it break through not caring or active ruining. The old kings we studied tonight believed their power gave them the right to treat other humans as things for their fun and tools for their plans. Their stories stand as forever reminders of where such thinking goes and why groups must never stop working to make sure that power serves people instead of eating them. As you move towards sleep, maybe you can find some comfort in knowing that the special forms of royal bad rule we looked at tonight belong to the past, cleaned away by hundreds of years of slow growth toward kinder and more answerable forms of ruling. Yet, their lessons stay important, giving help for seeing and fighting same patterns when they might come up in new forms. The power for both great bad and great good lives inside every human group, and the choice between them stays a living one that each new group must make. The darkness of old royal badness has been changed not by promised light, but by the continuing chance of choosing light over darkness, right over bad rule, caring over cruelty, sweet dreams. And remember that even in history's darkest parts, the human power for hope, fighting back, and good growth has never been completely put out. The fights of those who stood against old bad rule echo forward through time, giving strength to each new group to make worlds worthy of human respect and dreams.